Make sure Sophia gets the vendor badge, not the family one. My sister-in-law whispered near the wedding entrance, loud enough for 3 bridesmaids and half the valet line to hear. I don't want people confused about who actually belongs here. My husband laughed softly beside her. Not uncomfortable, not nervous, just amused. Then he looked directly at me and said, "Please don't make tonight difficult." A second later, the wedding coordinator took the gold-edged guest pass out of my hand and replaced it with a plain white badge that said "Event Staff" across the front in block letters. I still remember how cold the cardstock felt against my fingers. The violin quartet kept playing somewhere behind me while guests in black tuxedos and silk gowns walked past, pretending not to stare. That was the moment I realized the humiliation had been planned before I even arrived. Before we go any further, if this story truly resonates with you, if you've ever been made to feel small by the people who were supposed to love you, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and leaving a comment with the city or country you're watching from and your local time right now. I always read them late at night when the world finally gets quiet. My name is Sofia Navarro. I'm 34 years old, and the night my husband stood beside his sister and called me a freeloader at her wedding was the same night everything inside their family finally started to collapse. But the truth is, this story didn't begin at the wedding. It began 10 years earlier in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic, burnt coffee, and fear. The Callaways loved appearances more than honesty. That's the simplest way I can explain them. Their family estate sat on 6 acres outside Greenwich, Connecticut, hidden behind iron gates and rows of perfectly trimmed hedges that looked expensive in a very intentional way. White stone fountain in the front circle drive, imported olive trees near the west garden, a 4-car garage that somehow still never had enough room because Ethan's mother, Margaret, changed luxury SUVs every year like people changed phone cases. The family talked about money the way other people talked about weather, casually, constantly. At dinner, Margaret would ask questions like, "Do you think old money can survive another generation of mediocrity?" While the house staff quietly poured wine behind her chair. Vanessa was worse. She treated wealth like a personality trait. When I first met her, she looked me up and down during Thanksgiving dinner and asked Ethan, "So what exactly does Sophia do?" I told her I worked in patient care administration at St. Vincent's Hospital. She smiled politely before saying, "Oh, that sounds stable." Stable, the kind of word rich people use when they think your life is small. Ethan used to defend me back then. At least I thought he did. "Sophia works harder than anyone I know," he'd say while squeezing my hand under the table. But over the years, those moments disappeared one by one until silence became easier for him than disagreement, especially around his family, especially around Vanessa. By the time we'd been married 6 years, I had learned how to survive Callaway dinners by speaking less. I learned how to smile through insults, disguised as jokes. I learned how to pretend not to notice when Margaret introduced me to guests as Ethan's wife without using my name. And I learned that humiliation sounds different when it comes wrapped in expensive manners. 3 days before the wedding, Vanessa invited me to lunch at a cafe near Madison Avenue. She arrived 20 minutes late wearing oversized sunglasses and carrying a cream-colored leather planner that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. "I need a favor," she said while stirring oat milk into her coffee without looking at me. "What kind of favor?" I asked. "Nothing major. Just don't wear anything flashy to the wedding." I blinked. "Flashy? You know." She waved one manicured hand vaguely. "Anything that makes it look like you're trying too hard." I stared at her across the table while traffic moved outside the cafe windows. "Vanessa, it's your wedding. Why would I try to compete with you?" She smiled then. Slow. Thin. "Good. I'm glad you understand." That should have been enough warning, but I still went. I still spent 2 hours curling my hair that afternoon in the upstairs guest bathroom, because Ethan said his mother had hired photographers from Manhattan and everyone would be there. I still wore the navy blue dress I bought 6 months earlier during a clearance sale in White Plains, because Ethan once told me it made my eyes look softer. I still drove 45 minutes to the estate believing maybe, just maybe, families eventually grow kinder with time. Instead, the moment I stepped out of the car, one of the event assistants handed me a clipboard and asked where the dessert trays should go. "I'm not staff," I said quietly. The girl looked embarrassed immediately. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. Vanessa told us someone named Sophia would help coordinate overflow seating. I stood there holding my purse against my ribs while cold October wind moved through the courtyard. Inside the glass ballroom, I could already hear laughter and champagne glasses clinking together. Then Ethan appeared at the entrance adjusting his cufflinks. "There you are," he said. "We're starting photos." I looked down at the white badge still hanging around my neck. "Your sister told people I work here." Ethan exhaled sharply like I was exhausting him already. "It's just a joke, Sophia. A joke? Can we not do this tonight?" He lowered his voice. "Vanessa's stressed enough." I watched him straighten his tie in the reflection of the ballroom windows instead of looking at me directly, and something cold moved quietly through my chest because for the first time in our marriage, I realized Ethan wasn't embarrassed by what his family was doing to me. He was embarrassed by me. A few minutes later, I walked into the reception hall and saw the seating chart near the entrance. My name wasn't there. I stood in front of the seating chart for several seconds, pretending to search for my name even after I already knew it was not there. The gold calligraphy cards were pinned neatly against cream velvet boards under soft chandelier lighting. Ethan Calloway, Margaret Calloway, Vanessa and Grant, family friends from Greenwich Country Club, investors, neighbors, even people I had never met before had assigned seats, but not me. My reflection stared back at me faintly through the glass covering the board. Navy blue dress, pearl earrings, white vendor badge hanging against my chest like a punishment. Behind me, guests drifted through the ballroom carrying crystal champagne flutes, while waiters passed trays of crab cakes and truffle tartlets. Nobody said anything directly to me. That was the Calloway way. Humiliation always arrived dressed as politeness. "Oh no," a voice said beside me. "Did they forget you?" I turned and found Vanessa standing there with one hand resting lightly against the arm of her wedding planner. Her smile looked almost sympathetic if you did not know her well. "There must have been a mix-up." "There is no seat card," I said quietly. She tilted her head. "Well, technically you were not included in the immediate family count." Immediate family. I repeated the word silently in my head while Ethan finally walked over adjusting the cuff of his tuxedo. "What is going on now?" he asked. Vanessa gave a small helpless shrug before I could answer. "We are just trying to solve the seating issue." Ethan glanced at the board for less than 2 seconds. "Sophia, can you just sit at one of the overflow tables?" Overflow tables. The phrase landed harder than it should have. I looked at him waiting for some sign that he understood how humiliating this was. Some tiny shift in his expression that said he still saw me as his wife, instead of a problem to manage. But he only checked his watch. "The ceremony starts in 20 minutes, he said. "Please do not turn this into something bigger." Then he walked away beside his sister while she slipped her arm through his. I watched them disappear into the crowd together and suddenly remembered the first time I met the Calloways 8 years earlier. Back then, Ethan still kissed me in parking lots outside the hospital. Back then, he still looked at me like I mattered. His father, Richard, had invited me to Sunday dinner at the estate, only 3 months after Ethan and I started dating. I had spent an entire afternoon trying to decide what to wear. Nothing in my closet looked expensive enough for a Greenwich mansion. I finally settled on a cream sweater dress from Macy's and low black heels that pinched my toes after 30 minutes. Ethan told me I looked beautiful anyway. "My family can be intense," he warned while driving through the iron gates that evening. "But once they know you, they will love you." I believed him then. The dining room looked like something from a magazine spread. 12-foot ceilings, oil paintings in gold frames, silver candle holders running the length of the table. Margaret barely glanced at me before asking Ethan whether he had finalized his application to Wharton's executive finance program. Vanessa interrupted halfway through dinner to announce she had just returned from St. Barthélemy with friends. "You would love it there," she told me casually while cutting into her filet mignon. "Although honestly, it is kind of wasted on people who do not travel often." Ethan laughed softly at that. Not cruelly. Just enough to let her know she had an audience. Later that night, while helping clear dishes in the kitchen, one of the housekeepers whispered to me in Spanish, "Do not let them make you feel invisible." I never forgot that sentence. At first, I thought the tension came from money. The Calloways had old East Coast wealth, and I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment above a bakery in Stamford with a mother who worked double shifts as a respiratory nurse. My father left when I was 11. Some nights, my mother came home smelling like antiseptic wipes and cafeteria coffee because she had worked 16 straight hours. We did not have trust funds or summer homes or monogrammed linen napkins. We had coupons folded inside kitchen drawers and one old Honda Civic that overheated every August. But my mother carried herself with dignity no matter how tired she was. Never apologize for surviving, she used to tell me while brushing my hair before school. The Callaways apologized for nothing because they had never needed to survive anything. Over time, I started noticing patterns. Vanessa forgot my birthday every year but expected designer gifts for hers. Margaret criticized the way I folded cloth napkins at Thanksgiving. Ethan slowly stopped correcting them. Once during Christmas dinner, Margaret asked whether I planned to eventually contribute more financially now that Ethan's career was advancing. I sat there gripping my fork while Ethan stared down at his plate and said nothing. Afterward in the car, I asked him why he did not defend me. He sighed heavily against the steering wheel. Because every dinner turns into a conflict with you lately. Your mother implied I am using you. She was joking. No, she was not. Ethan rubbed his forehead like I was exhausting him. Sophia, not everything has to become emotional. That was the beginning of something changing between us. Small at first, then permanent. Back inside the wedding ballroom, I finally found an empty chair near the service entrance beside two distant cousins and an elderly man asleep through most of dinner. The speakers overhead played soft jazz while Vanessa moved from table to table accepting compliments like royalty greeting subjects. I barely touched the food on my plate. Halfway through the salad course, I noticed Margaret leaning toward Ethan across the head table. Did Arthur confirm the paperwork? She asked quietly. Ethan nodded once. Next week. Vanessa smiled into her wine glass. Good, then we can finally move forward. I do not know why those words unsettled me as much as they did. Maybe it was the way all three of them suddenly glanced toward me afterward, before looking away too quickly. Or maybe it was because deep down, somewhere beneath years of silence and compromise, I had already started sensing there was something happening inside that family that nobody wanted me to see. The rest of dinner passed in a blur of silver utensils, forced laughter, and tiny humiliations so polished they almost looked elegant. Every time a waiter came near the head table, Vanessa touched his arm dramatically and thanked him by name loud enough for everyone to hear. Meanwhile, nobody at my table even asked if I wanted coffee. Across the ballroom, Ethan leaned comfortably beside his mother, while candlelight flickered against rows of crystal glasses and expensive floral arrangements flown in from California that morning. I watched him laugh at something Vanessa whispered in his ear and suddenly remembered a completely different version of him. One who used to sit beside me on the floor of my apartment eating takeout noodles at midnight while studying finance textbooks he could barely afford. One who used to kiss my forehead before every overnight shift at the hospital and tell me, "One day I am going to give you everything." Somewhere along the way, the version of Ethan who loved me quietly disappeared, and the Callaways replaced him with someone who measured human value the same way they measured wine collections and stock portfolios. About an hour into the reception, the ballroom lights dimmed slightly as servers rolled out the wedding cake. Vanessa stood near the center dance floor in a custom silk gown worth more than my first car, while guests lifted phones to capture every angle. "Can we all agree she looks incredible?" Margaret announced proudly from the microphone. Applause filled the room immediately. Vanessa smiled with practiced grace before saying, "Thank you all for supporting Grant and me as we begin this next chapter surrounded by people who truly belong in our lives." Her eyes landed on me for half a second. Not enough for anyone else to notice, long enough for me to understand exactly what she meant. Then the speeches began. Grant's best man told a story about yacht trips in Nantucket. Vanessa's maid of honor joked about boarding schools and trust funds. The crowd laughed easily because wealth always sounds charming when rich people tell stories about it. I stayed quiet near the edge of the ballroom, nursing a glass of sparkling water that had already gone flat. At some point during the speeches, an older man entered through the side doors wearing a dark charcoal suit and carrying a thin leather portfolio under one arm. He paused near the entrance, scanning the room carefully before exchanging a short nod with Margaret. Something about him felt strangely familiar, though I could not place why. "Who is that?" I quietly asked one of the servers passing nearby. "Family attorney, I think," she whispered back. "He arrived late from Manhattan. Family attorney." My stomach tightened slightly at the words. Across the room, Ethan noticed him too. He stood immediately and crossed toward the entrance while adjusting his jacket. Vanessa followed close behind. The three of them disappeared briefly into the hallway outside the ballroom, and when they returned 10 minutes later, Vanessa looked almost radiant with satisfaction. Ethan avoided eye contact with me completely. That unsettled me more than anything else that night. A few minutes later, I slipped outside to the back terrace for air. October cold wrapped around me immediately, carrying the smell of rain and distant ocean salt from Long Island Sound. Tiny white lights glowed across the stone railings, while music from inside pulsed faintly through the ballroom walls. I stood there rubbing my hands together when I heard heels clicking behind me. "You always disappear when things get uncomfortable." Vanessa's voice carried lightly through the cold air. I turned slowly. She stood near the doorway holding a champagne glass in one hand. "I came out for air," I said. "Of course," she smiled. "Although honestly, I would probably hide too if my own husband barely acknowledged me all night." The words landed cleanly, deliberately. I stared at her for several seconds before answering. "What exactly did I ever do to you?" Vanessa laughed softly like I had asked something childish. "You existed in spaces you were never supposed to." "What does that even mean?" "It means people like you marry into families like mine and think surviving beside us somehow makes you equal to us." The wind shifted hard across the terrace. Somewhere inside, guests began clapping for the first dance. I looked at her carefully then. Really looked at her. Perfect hair, diamond earrings reflecting ballroom light, calm expression practiced over decades of winning every room she entered. But underneath all of it, I saw something else for the first time that night. Fear. Tiny. Hidden. Real. "You hate me because Richard trusted me," I said quietly before I could stop myself. Vanessa's entire expression changed for less than a second. Then it disappeared again. "You should be careful bringing up my father tonight." "Why?" "Because not every promise he made before he died can actually protect you anymore." My chest tightened instantly. "What does that mean?" She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You really think Ethan stayed with you because he loved you?" I felt my fingers curl automatically against the stone railing behind me. "Vanessa, you should have paid attention sooner, Sophia." Her smile returned slowly. "A lot has been happening around you lately." Then she walked back inside before I could answer. I stood frozen on the terrace, while cold wind lifted strands of hair across my face. Inside the ballroom, the band started playing Frank Sinatra, while guests applauded the bride and groom. But all I could hear was one sentence repeating quietly inside my head. Not every promise he made before he died can actually protect you anymore. And for the first time that night, I realized this wedding was not just about humiliation. Something else was happening inside that family. Something legal, something planned. And somehow, without fully understanding how yet, I was standing directly in the middle of it. I stayed on the terrace long after Vanessa disappeared back into the ballroom. The October air had turned sharper, colder against my skin, but I barely noticed anymore. My mind kept replaying her words over and over, like a song stuck in the background of a nightmare. Not every promise he made before he died can actually protect you anymore. Inside, laughter erupted near the dance floor as the band shifted into something upbeat and expensive sounding. Through the tall glass windows, I could see Ethan spinning Vanessa dramatically, while guests clapped along. He looked relaxed, happy even, not like a husband who had spent the entire evening humiliating his wife in front of 200 people. I watched him carefully, and suddenly I realized something that made my stomach tighten harder than before. He had known exactly what tonight was going to be. None of this had surprised him. Not the missing seat. Not the vendor badge. Not the jokes. He had walked into this wedding already prepared to let it happen. My chest felt hollow as I finally stepped back inside. Warm air rushed over me carrying perfume, candle smoke, and the buttery smell of expensive catered food. Nobody noticed me at first. That almost hurt more. I moved quietly past the dance floor toward the hallway leading to the restrooms when I heard voices behind a partially closed door near the library entrance. Ethan's voice. "We just need her signature before the refinance closes." I froze instantly. Margaret answered in a lower tone. "And if she refuses?" "She will not." Ethan sounded calm. Too calm. "She does not even know what she is signing half the time." My fingers tightened automatically around my clutch purse. Through the narrow opening in the door, I could see the three of them standing together. Ethan, Margaret, Vanessa still holding her champagne glass. The family attorney stood nearby, flipping through papers inside his leather portfolio. You should have handled this months ago, Vanessa said sharply. Dragging it out made everything messier. Ethan rubbed his jaw impatiently. I was trying to avoid a scene. Margaret laughed softly under her breath. Please, Sophia avoids scenes better than anyone I have ever met. The room chuckled lightly at that. Something inside me cracked quietly. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just enough to change the shape of everything I thought my marriage still was. I leaned closer without meaning to. Once the transfer clears, the attorney said carefully, the estate technically becomes protected under the new ownership structure. Good, Margaret replied immediately, because I am tired of pretending that girl belongs in this family. Girl. I was 34 years old. I had spent nearly a decade helping hold their lives together while they treated me like temporary furniture. Ethan exhaled heavily. Can we please keep this simple tonight? Simple, Vanessa snapped. You married her without a prenup, Ethan. Father practically worshipped her after the stroke. We are lucky Arthur found a legal path around that mess at all. My heartbeat slowed strangely then. Not faster. Slower. Cold. Controlled. The attorney glanced toward Ethan carefully. There is still one issue. Ethan looked up immediately. What issue? If Sophia challenges the original trust conditions in court, things could become complicated. Silence followed that sentence. Tiny. Tight. Dangerous. Then Margaret spoke first. She will not challenge anything. Sophia has spent years begging this family to love her. Women like her do not suddenly become difficult. Women like her. I stepped backward before anyone could hear me breathing. My heels clicked softly against the marble hallway as I turned toward the restroom, my vision blurring slightly around the edges. Inside the empty bathroom, soft music floated faintly through the ceiling speakers, while gold sconces reflected warm light against white marble counters. I locked myself inside the furthest stall and sat down slowly with trembling hands. My marriage had not been falling apart accidentally. It had been managed, planned, coordinated quietly behind closed doors, while I kept defending Ethan to myself over and over again like an idiot. Every strange conversation suddenly made sense. Every late-night phone call he took outside. Every financial document he rushed me through signing over the past year. It is just paperwork for the estate taxes. It is only temporary refinancing. My mother needs this handled quickly. I pressed my hand against my mouth hard enough to stop myself from making a sound. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. 3 weeks earlier, Ethan sitting beside me at the kitchen island while scrolling through emails on his phone. Arthur might stop by next month, he said casually. There are a few trust updates from Dad's estate that need signatures. I remember looking up from my coffee. What kind of updates? Nothing important. He barely glanced at me. Mostly technical ownership adjustments. Ownership adjustments. My stomach twisted violently. Outside the restroom door, I heard women laughing as they walked past discussing wedding photos and honeymoon plans. The normalness of it felt unreal compared to the quiet destruction happening inside my chest. I stared down at my wedding ring for several seconds beneath the soft bathroom lighting. Then slowly, for the first time since Ethan proposed to me 8 years earlier, I slipped it off my finger. The pale mark it left behind looked almost shocking against my skin. I sat there holding the ring in my palm while tears burned hot behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Because somewhere beneath the humiliation and betrayal and exhaustion, another feeling had started rising quietly inside me. Anger. Not loud anger. Not reckless anger. The dangerous kind. The kind that arrives only after love finally runs out. A knock sounded suddenly against the restroom door. Sophia? It was Ethan. Open the door. I stayed silent. Another knock, sharper this time. We need to talk. His voice sounded strained now, nervous, and for the first time all night I realized something else. Ethan was not afraid of losing me. He was afraid I had finally started understanding what they were trying to take. I did not open the restroom door when Ethan knocked the third time. I sat perfectly still inside the stall, holding my wedding ring tightly in my palm, while the soft jazz music outside continued like nothing in the world had changed. Sophia, he said again, quieter now. Please. The word sounded strange coming from him. Not loving, not apologetic, controlled, like a man trying to stop a problem before it became expensive. I closed my eyes for a second and remembered all the years I had mistaken calm manipulation for maturity. I know you are upset, he continued through the door, but you are misunderstanding things. Misunderstanding. The word almost made me laugh. I stared at the pale line where my ring used to sit and realized Ethan had spent years teaching me to doubt my own instincts every time they threatened his comfort. "The refinance has nothing to do with you personally," he said. "It is just business. Just business." I finally stood slowly and unlocked the stall, but I did not open the restroom door yet. Instead, I walked to the sink and splashed cold water against my wrists while staring at myself in the mirror. My makeup still looked intact. My hair still curled softly over my shoulders. From the outside, I still looked like someone whose life had not quietly collapsed over the course of one wedding reception. "Sophia?" Ethan's voice tightened slightly. "Can we please not do this tonight?" I opened the door then. Ethan stood there alone in the hallway, one hand pressed against the wall beside him. His tuxedo jacket hung slightly open now, his tie loosened just enough to look human again. For a split second, part of me almost wanted to believe him. That old dangerous instinct to protect the marriage before protecting myself. "You lied to me," I said quietly. He exhaled heavily. "No. I heard all of you talking." His jaw tightened immediately. "You were listening outside private conversations?" I stared at him in disbelief. Even now, he wanted me to feel guilty instead of betrayed. "You are trying to take the estate away from me. The estate was never yours." The sentence came out too quickly, too sharp. Ethan noticed it immediately, too. Silence settled between us. Somewhere behind him, guests laughed loudly near the ballroom bar while glasses clinked together. Finally, he lowered his voice. "Sophia, things changed after Dad died. Apparently. You know my mother is under pressure financially. Your mother owns 3 properties. Those properties are leveraged. So now I am the problem?" Ethan rubbed his forehead impatiently. "Nobody is saying that. Vanessa literally called me a freeloader tonight. She was emotional. I laughed once then, quietly, coldly. You stood there and let her." Ethan looked away first. That hurt more than the answer would have. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. "Look," he said carefully, "can we just get through tonight peacefully?" He unlocked the screen and showed me an email thread between him, Margaret, and the attorney Arthur Bennett. My eyes scanned the subject line immediately. Estate restructuring timeline. Below it sat multiple forwarded attachments and legal notes. One sentence near the bottom made my chest tighten instantly. "Sophia's signature required before transfer finalization." Ethan quickly lowered the phone. Too late. I had already seen it. "You were never going to tell me the truth," I whispered. "That is not fair." "Fair?" I stared at him. "You humiliated me in front of your entire family tonight because you needed me weak enough to sign something. That is not what this is. Then what is it?" His expression hardened slightly then. "Not angry. Defensive. Cornered. My father made emotional decisions near the end of his life. He trusted me. He was sick." The sentence landed like a slap. I stepped backward instinctively. Ethan noticed immediately. "That is not what I meant." "Yes, it is." My voice barely sounded like mine anymore. "You all think I manipulated him." "Nobody said manipulated. You do not have to." Ethan moved closer, lowering his voice again. "Please just come back inside. People are already asking questions." There it was. Not concern for me, concern for appearances. The same disease that infected everyone in that family eventually. I looked at him for a long moment before slipping my wedding ring into my clutch purse instead of putting it back on. Ethan noticed that too. His face changed instantly. "Do not do that." "Do what?" "Make this bigger than it needs to be." I almost asked him whether he could still hear himself anymore. Instead, I walked past him toward the ballroom entrance. Ethan caught my wrist lightly before I could leave. "Sophia." I looked down at his hand until he slowly let go. "I have spent years defending you to myself," I said softly. "Do not make me regret all of them at once." Then I walked away. The ballroom looked brighter now. Louder. More artificial somehow. Vanessa stood near the cake table smiling for photographs, while Margaret entertained investors beside the champagne tower. Nobody looking at them would have guessed an entire family conspiracy sat hidden beneath all that polished wealth and perfect lighting. I returned to my seat near the service entrance and quietly checked my phone under the tablecloth. 7 unread messages from Ethan already. "We will talk later. Please stop overreacting. You heard part of a conversation and misunderstood it. Do not embarrass both of us tonight. The last message arrived 30 seconds later. Just sign the papers when Arthur brings them. It will make everything easier. I stared at the screen while the band started another song near the dance floor. Easier for who? My throat tightened painfully, but I refused to cry there. Not in front of them. Not where they could mistake my grief for weakness. Around me, guests kept laughing and eating and celebrating, while I sat completely alone at a wedding where my own husband had quietly become a stranger. By the time the wedding reception finally started winding down, my entire body felt numb from holding myself together for too many hours. Guests gathered near the valet circle outside, wrapped in expensive coats, while black SUVs lined the driveway beneath strings of soft white lights. Somewhere behind me, the band played its final song while servers quietly cleared champagne glasses from the ballroom tables. I stood alone near the coat check, clutching my purse against my ribs, and watching married couples leave together into the cold Connecticut night. Ethan had not spoken to me again after the messages. Not face to face. Not like a husband trying to save his marriage. Only short texts spaced carefully apart like instructions from someone managing damage control. Where are you? We should leave soon. Please do not create a problem tonight. The last message sat unopened on my screen while I stared at the reflection of myself in the dark glass entrance doors. For the first time in years, I looked exhausted in a way sleep could not fix. Mrs. Calloway? One of the younger servers approached quietly, holding my shawl folded neatly over her arms. You forgot this near your table. Thank you, I said automatically. She hesitated before lowering her voice. I just wanted to say, I do not think you deserved how they treated you tonight. The kindness almost broke me more than the cruelty had. I swallowed carefully. That is very sweet of you. My mother married into a family like this, she whispered while glancing toward the ballroom. People with money think silence means they are right. Then she quickly walked away before I could answer. I stood there for several seconds staring after her while cold air drifted in every time the entrance doors opened. Silence means they are right. The sentence settled heavily inside me because she was right. For years I had stayed quiet, believing patience would eventually earn me love. Believing dignity would matter to people who only respected power. A few minutes later, Ethan finally appeared near the front steps with his tuxedo jacket thrown over one shoulder. There you are, he said flatly. No concern, no apology. Just irritation. The driver has been waiting. I followed him toward the black town car parked near the fountain without speaking. Gravel crunched softly beneath my heels, while distant laughter carried from the ballroom behind us. Once inside the car, neither of us moved for several seconds. The city lights passed quietly outside the windows as we drove away from the estate. Finally, Ethan exhaled sharply beside me. You embarrassed me tonight. I turned slowly toward him. I embarrassed you? You made everything tense. I stared at him in disbelief. Your family called me a freeloader in front of 200 people. Vanessa was joking. Stop saying that. My voice cracked slightly for the first time all night. Ethan looked out the window instead of at me. You have been looking for reasons to feel attacked for months now. That sentence hurt because part of me recognized it. The careful twisting of reality. The quiet repositioning of blame. Suddenly, I remembered my mother sitting beside me at our tiny kitchen table years earlier after my father left. The worst loneliness, she once told me softly while folding hospital scrubs late at night, is realizing someone stopped protecting your heart long before they stopped saying they loved you. Back then, I thought she was talking about abandonment. I did not understand she was talking about erosion, the slow wearing down of trust, until one day there is nothing left but habit and silence. Ethan checked his phone again while we crossed the bridge toward Greenwich. Arthur is coming by Tuesday, he said casually. About the paperwork. I looked at him carefully. I am not signing anything. His jaw tightened immediately. Sophia, no. You do not even understand the details yet. Then explain them. He stayed silent. The car filled with the low hum of tires against wet pavement. Exactly, I whispered. Ethan rubbed both hands across his face slowly. For the first time that night, he suddenly looked tired instead of angry. You think this is easy for me? He asked quietly. I almost laughed at the cruelty of the question. Easy for you? My father created a mess before he died. Your father trusted me. He trusted people emotionally. Meaning what? Ethan turned toward me then. meaning he saw you as some kind of savior because you sat beside his hospital bed for months while the rest of us were handling actual business. Actual business. I felt something inside me go completely still. Richard Calloway had spent nearly a year recovering after his stroke. During that time, Ethan and Vanessa rarely visited unless lawyers or accountants were involved. I was the one who stayed overnight when Richard became confused and frightened after surgery. I was the one who learned how he took his medication. I was the one who sat beside him during physical therapy appointments, while snow piled outside the rehabilitation center windows. I remembered one particular night clearly. Richard sitting weakly beside the hospital window watching January snow fall over Manhattan while quietly saying, "You are the only person in this family who still sees people before money." I never told Ethan about that conversation. Somehow it felt private, sacred almost. Now sitting beside his son in the back of that silent car, I finally understood why Richard had sounded so tired when he said it. When we reached the estate, Ethan went inside without waiting for me. I remained standing near the driveway for a long moment, staring at the enormous house glowing warmly against the dark sky. 8 years of marriage lived inside those walls. Holidays, quiet breakfasts, arguments, promises, grief. And somehow standing there that night, the house no longer felt like home. It felt like a place where I had slowly disappeared without noticing. Upstairs, I heard Ethan moving around our bedroom while I stayed alone downstairs in the darkened kitchen. The refrigerator hummed softly beside me. Rain tapped lightly against the windows. I sat at the long marble island where I had spent years drinking coffee beside a man who no longer looked at me with love and realized there was nobody left I could call. My mother was gone. Richard was gone. The marriage I thought I had was gone too. And for the first time in my life, the loneliness did not feel temporary. It felt complete. Then my phone vibrated quietly against the countertop. One new message. Unknown number. I opened it slowly. "We need to speak before Tuesday. You were never told the full truth about Richard's estate." I stared at the message on my phone for nearly a full minute before replying. "Who is this?" 3 dots appeared immediately, then disappeared, reappeared again. Finally, a new message came through. Eleanor Bennett, Arthur Bennett's wife. My stomach tightened the second I read the name. Arthur Bennett was the Calloway family attorney. I remembered Eleanor vaguely from Richard's funeral reception 2 years earlier. Quiet woman, silver hair, kind eyes. She had squeezed my hand once in the kitchen while everyone else argued about estate taxes in the dining room. Back then I thought she pitied me. Now I wondered if she knew far more than she ever said aloud. Another message arrived. "Richard trusted you for a reason. Meet me tomorrow morning. Come alone." I barely slept that night. Around 3 in the morning, I heard Ethan moving downstairs briefly before leaving the house without explanation. His car tires crunched softly against wet gravel outside, then disappeared into silence. I sat awake in the dark guest room, staring at rain sliding slowly down the windows, and realized something strange. I was no longer waiting for him to come back and fix things. That hope had finally died sometime, between the vendor badge and the hallway conversation outside the library. By morning, the estate felt colder than usual. The housekeepers moved quietly through the kitchen, preparing coffee, while Margaret's assistant sorted floral deliveries near the front hall. Nobody acknowledged the tension hanging over the house. Wealthy families treated emotional collapse the same way they treated plumbing problems, quietly, behind closed doors. I left before Ethan returned and drove 30 minutes south to a small cafe near the Stamford Marina, where Eleanor Bennett waited alone beside the window. Gray wool coat, reading glasses resting near her untouched teacup. She looked up the moment I entered. "Sophia." Her voice sounded gentler than I expected. "Thank you for coming." I sat across from her carefully. "Your husband works for the Calloways." "My husband works for whoever signs the checks," she replied calmly. "That does not mean he always agrees with them." Outside the cafe windows, fishing boats rocked gently against the docks, while cold Atlantic wind pushed rain across the harbor. Eleanor studied me quietly for several seconds before speaking again. "You look exactly the way Richard looked during his last year alive." "What does that mean?" "Tired of being surrounded by people who confuse money with character." I looked down at my coffee cup. Steam curled softly upward between us. Finally, I asked the question that had been sitting inside my chest all night. What did Richard actually leave me? Eleanor reached into her bag slowly and slid a thin envelope across the table. My name was written across the front in Richard's handwriting. Seeing it nearly took the air from my lungs. "Arthur was never supposed to hide this from you," she said quietly. But after Richard died, Margaret pressured everyone involved. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened the envelope. Inside sat a handwritten letter dated 6 months before Richard passed away. "Sophia, if you are reading this, it means my family has already started trying to rewrite the truth." I stopped breathing for a second. Eleanor watched me carefully while I continued reading. "You stayed when everyone else measured my illness by how it affected their inheritance. You sat beside me when I could not walk without help. You listened when nobody else had patience left. This house survived because of you long before anyone realized it." Beneath the letter sat copies of legal trust documents carrying Richard's signature and 2 witness signatures from the rehabilitation center. My eyes moved slowly across the language. Conditional transfer of controlling residential interest. Beneficiary, Sophia Navarro Calloway. My pulse started pounding harder. "I do not understand," I whispered. Eleanor folded her hands together. "Richard restructured ownership of the estate after his stroke. Why? Because he discovered Ethan and Vanessa had been quietly borrowing against family assets for years." I looked up sharply. "What?" "Credit lines, risky investments, failed business ventures." Eleanor sighed softly. "Richard covered most of it privately to avoid scandal." Suddenly, dozens of strange memories rearranged themselves inside my head. Ethan's constant financial stress despite his salary. Vanessa selling jewelry she claimed she no longer liked. Margaret's sudden obsession with refinancing conversations. The house was collateral. Eleanor continued carefully. Richard protected it by transferring controlling authority into the trust. To me? Because you were the only person he believed would not exploit it. My throat tightened painfully. For years I had believed Richard simply cared about me. I never understood how deeply he distrusted his own children. "Then why does Arthur keep helping them?" I asked quietly. Eleanor gave a tired smile. "Because protecting wealthy families often becomes more profitable than protecting truth." We sat in silence for several moments, while rain tapped gently against the cafe windows. Finally, Eleanor leaned slightly closer. "Sophia, listen to me carefully. Ethan believes you never fully understood the trust documents Richard signed during rehabilitation." I did not. "Good." Her expression sharpened slightly. "Keep letting him believe that." I stared at her. "What are they planning?" "To pressure you into signing away your controlling interest before the lenders discover the estate's actual debt exposure." Cold spread slowly through my chest. "How bad is it?" Eleanor hesitated. "Bad enough that without your legal authorization, they could lose almost everything attached to the property." Almost everything. Suddenly, the humiliation at the wedding made horrifying sense. They had not just wanted me embarrassed. They needed me weakened, isolated, easier to manipulate. Eleanor slid a business card across the table toward me. "There is someone Richard trusted outside the family." "Who?" "A financial litigator in Manhattan. Her name is Julia Mercer." I looked down at the card while morning light shifted faintly through the storm clouds outside. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt something unfamiliar moving quietly beneath the grief and exhaustion. Not revenge, clarity. The kind that comes after illusions finally die. Eleanor stood slowly gathering her coat. "You spent too many years surviving inside that family," she said softly. "Now it is time to understand exactly who you are without them." After she left, I stayed alone at the cafe, watching rain move across the harbor, while Richard's letter rested open beside my coffee cup. Outside, boats kept rocking steadily against the docks no matter how hard the wind pushed them, and somewhere deep inside me, something that had been broken for a very long time finally started learning how to stand back up. 3 weeks after the wedding, I moved into a furnished 1-bedroom apartment above a bookstore in Stamford with 2 suitcases, a coffee maker, and Richard's letter folded carefully inside my nightstand drawer. The apartment smelled faintly like old paper and cinnamon from the cafe downstairs. The floors creaked when I walked too quickly across them, and the radiator hissed loudly every morning around 6. It was nothing like the Calloway estate with its marble staircases and imported chandeliers. But for the first time in years, I could breathe inside my own home without feeling judged for existing there. Ethan called constantly during the first week after I left. 23 missed calls the first day alone. Then emails started arriving. We need to talk like adults. You are overreacting. My mother is devastated. We can still fix this if you stop listening to outsiders. I stopped answering after the fourth voicemail. Not because I was trying to punish him, because every conversation left me feeling smaller afterward. The only message I responded to came 5 days later when he texted, "Arthur needs your signature by Friday." I stared at the screen for a long moment before replying with 2 words, "Not happening." He did not text again that night. The next morning I met Julia Mercer at her office in Midtown Manhattan, 43rd floor. Glass conference rooms overlooking the Hudson. Reception desk carved from white stone. Everyone moved quickly there, confidently, like people accustomed to solving expensive problems. Julia herself looked nothing like the attorneys Margaret usually hired for charity galas and estate dinners. No polished fake warmth, no rehearsed social smile. She wore a navy pantsuit, silver watch, and running shoes beneath her desk, like someone who valued efficiency more than appearances. "You should have come to me months ago," she said after reviewing Richard's documents. "I did not know there was anything to come for." Julia looked up sharply. "That family trained you to underestimate your own position." The sentence stayed with me long after the meeting ended. Over the next few weeks, my entire life quietly reorganized itself around legal appointments, financial reviews, and rebuilding routines I had abandoned during my marriage. I started sleeping through the night again. I cooked simple dinners for myself, instead of managing elaborate meals for people who barely thanked me. I returned to Street, Vincent's hospital part-time consulting on patient operations systems, and something strange happened there. People listened when I spoke. "Your restructuring plan cut emergency intake delays by 30%, Dr. Kaplan told me during one meeting while flipping through reports. "Do you realize how rare that is?" I blinked slightly. "I was just trying to simplify the workflow. Most administrators complicate things to justify their salaries." He smiled. "You actually solve problems." Solve problems. Nobody in the Calloway family had ever described me that way. At the hospital, my badge finally reflected my full title again, Sophia Navarro, Operational Systems Consultant. The first morning I clipped it onto my navy blazer before work, I stood staring at it for several seconds in the apartment mirror. Such a small thing. Plastic badge. Blue lettering. Yet somehow it felt larger than any diamond necklace Margaret ever wore to dinner parties. One rainy Thursday afternoon, I finished presenting a patient flow redesign to the executive board when my phone buzzed quietly against the conference table. Ethan. Again. I silenced it without reading the message. "Everything okay?" one of the board members asked after the meeting. "Yes," I answered honestly for the first time in months. Outside the hospital windows, ambulances moved steadily through wet city traffic, while nurses crossed the lobby carrying coffee cups and charts. Life continued there, no matter how dramatic wealthy family crises felt elsewhere. Nobody cared about trust funds inside emergency rooms. Nobody cared about social status when someone stopped breathing. That perspective grounded me in ways the estate never could. One evening after work, I stopped at a small grocery store near my apartment and noticed a magazine near the checkout counter, Greenwich Social Review. Vanessa and Grant smiled across the cover beneath the headline, Calloway Family Restructures Historic Estate Holdings. My chest tightened immediately. I flipped through the article standing there beside shelves of gum and bottled water. The piece described strategic financial transitions and new leadership structures inside the family portfolio. Not one mention of the legal dispute still hanging unresolved beneath all of it. But near the end of the article, one sentence stopped me cold. Sources close to the family expect final authorization signatures within the month. I bought the magazine without thinking and carried it home folded tightly beneath my arm. That night, Julia reviewed the article silently from across her office desk. "Interesting," she said finally. "What?" "They are bluffing publicly." She slid the magazine back toward me. "Which means privately they are running out of time. How bad is the situation really?" Julia leaned back slowly in her chair. "Without your authorization, refinancing deadlines start collapsing within 60 days. I stared at her carefully. "And if that happens, the lenders could force liquidation proceedings against multiple family assets." Liquidation. The word sounded unreal, attached to people like the Calloways. Families like theirs were supposed to survive everything through connections and lawyers and inherited money, yet beneath all the polished appearances, they were sinking. And somehow, whether they liked it or not, the person standing between them and disaster was still me. Later that night, I returned home exhausted and stopped beside the bookstore window downstairs before going up to my apartment. Rain reflected softly against the glass while warm yellow light spilled across rows of stacked novels inside. For the first time in years, I recognized the woman staring back at me in the reflection. Not Ethan's wife, not the tolerated outsider at family dinners. Just Sophia, tired still, hurt still, but no longer invisible. My phone buzzed again inside my coat pocket. This time the message came from Arthur Bennett himself. "We need to meet immediately. Your presence is required at the estate Sunday evening. Margaret has made certain decisions you deserve to hear in person." Sunday evening arrived cold and gray, the kind of Connecticut winter night where the sky darkens before 5 o'clock and every tree branch looks brittle against the clouds. I sat in my car outside the Calloway estate for nearly 2 full minutes before getting out. The iron gates stood open already, lights glowing softly along the curved driveway exactly the way they had every Christmas and charity dinner and family gathering for the last 8 years. Nothing about the house looked different from the outside. White stone walls, perfect hedges, warm light behind tall windows. It almost irritated me how beautiful the place still looked after everything hidden inside it. My boots crunched softly across the gravel as I walked toward the entrance, carrying only my leather folder and Julia's business card tucked inside my coat pocket. The front doors opened before I reached them. One of the longtime housekeepers, Elena, stood there quietly with tired eyes and folded hands. She had worked for the family longer than I had even known Ethan. "Mrs. Calloway," she said automatically before quickly correcting herself. "Sophia." I gave her a small smile. "Hi, Elena." Her expression softened slightly. "You look stronger." The sentence caught me off guard enough that I almost stopped walking. Stronger. Nobody inside this house had ever used that word for me before. "Thank you," I said quietly. Elena glanced toward the dining room before lowering her voice. "They have all been waiting." Of course they had. The foyer smelled faintly like lemon polish and fireplace smoke. Somewhere deeper in the house, low classical music played through hidden speakers, while snow started drifting lightly outside the tall front windows. I removed my gloves slowly, and noticed immediately that several framed family photographs had been rearranged since I left. New wedding portraits of Vanessa already sat displayed on the hallway tables. Ethan and I had been removed entirely. Efficient, clean, like erasing a business transaction after it failed. Margaret stood near the dining room fireplace holding a glass of red wine when I entered. Navy cashmere sweater, diamond earrings, perfect posture. She looked exactly like the kind of woman magazines described as elegant and tasteful. "You came," she said smoothly. Arthur made it sound important. Her eyes narrowed slightly at the tone in my voice. Across the room, Vanessa sat scrolling through something on her phone while Ethan leaned beside the windows with both hands in his pockets. None of them smiled at me. Arthur Bennett stood at the far end of the dining table surrounded by neatly stacked legal folders and a silver reading lamp. The atmosphere did not feel like family. It felt like a negotiation nobody trusted anymore. "Let us sit," Arthur said carefully. I took the chair closest to the doorway on purpose. Small detail, but for the first time since marrying into this family, I no longer wanted to be trapped in the middle of their table. Margaret noticed that immediately, too. "You always did choose distance instead of communication," she said lightly while sitting down. "Interesting," I replied calmly. "I remember spending years trying to communicate while everyone here pretended not to hear me." Silence settled briefly over the room. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably first. Ethan still would not meet my eyes directly. Arthur cleared his throat softly and opened one of the folders. "We are here to discuss the future of the estate." "No," I said quietly. "You are here because your refinancing timeline is collapsing." Every head at the table turned toward me instantly. Margaret's expression hardened first. "Who exactly have you been speaking with?" "People who tell the truth." Vanessa let out a sharp breath. "You have no idea how complicated this situation actually is." "Then explain it." "It is private financial business." I looked directly at her. "It became my business the moment all of you started trying to manipulate me into signing legal documents under false pretenses." Ethan finally spoke then, his voice tight with frustration. "Nobody manipulated you." I turned toward him slowly. "You sent me messages pressuring me to sign paperwork after humiliating me publicly at your sister's wedding." "Because we are running out of options," he snapped before catching himself too late. The room went still. Arthur lowered his eyes immediately toward the table. Margaret closed hers briefly, like someone watching years of careful image management crack in real time. I stared at Ethan carefully. Options for what? He looked away again. Ethan, I said quietly, look at me and answer the question. For several seconds he stayed silent. Then finally he exhaled hard and sat down heavily in his chair. Suddenly he looked older than 37, tired in a way expensive suits could not hide anymore. Dad secured too many liabilities against the estate after the recession, he said flatly. Then Vanessa's investment partnership collapsed last year. Vanessa stiffened immediately. Do not put this entirely on me. Your losses triggered the lender reviews, Ethan shot back. You promised the market would recover. Margaret slammed her wine glass onto the table hard enough to make the silverware shake slightly. Enough. Nobody spoke after that. Snow drifted quietly outside the windows while the fire crackled low beside the mantel. The silence inside that room felt heavier than shouting would have. Finally, Arthur removed his glasses slowly and folded both hands on top of the open file in front of him. There is another matter all of you need to address tonight, he said carefully. Margaret looked exhausted suddenly. Arthur. No, he replied quietly. It cannot wait anymore. My pulse slowed strangely as he opened a second folder and turned several pages toward me beneath the reading lamp. I recognized Richard's handwriting immediately before I even saw the signature. Across the table, Ethan's face lost color. Vanessa stopped breathing long enough for me to notice. Arthur looked directly at me then. Sophia, he said softly, there is something Richard instructed me to reveal, only if the estate reached this exact situation. The fire cracked softly behind us, while Arthur Bennett adjusted the papers beneath the reading lamp with careful hands. Nobody in the room moved. Outside the tall dining room windows, snow continued falling steadily across the dark estate grounds, covering the garden paths in white silence. Arthur looked older than I remembered suddenly, tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. Richard amended the estate structure 11 months before his death, he said quietly. At the time, several financial concerns had already become serious. Margaret immediately straightened in her chair. Arthur, we discussed this years ago. You discussed what was convenient, he replied without raising his voice. The room went still again. Ethan stared down at the polished wood table while Vanessa crossed her arms tightly against herself. I watched all of them carefully and realized something important. None of them looked confident anymore. Arthur turned one of the documents toward me beneath the light. Richard created a conditional trust authority tied specifically to the preservation of the primary estate property. My eyes moved slowly across the page. Legal language, signatures, witness certifications from the Rehabilitation Center in Manhattan. Then I saw my own name again. Beneficiary and controlling authority designee. Sophia Navarro Calloway. Margaret let out a sharp breath. This is ridiculous. Arthur ignored her completely. The trust was designed to activate under 2 conditions, he continued calmly. 1. If the estate entered financial distress caused by internal family mismanagement. 2. If coercive attempts were made to transfer or refinance the property without the informed consent of the controlling beneficiary. Ethan finally looked up sharply. Dad never explained it like that. Arthur's expression did not change. Your father explained it very clearly. Silence settled heavily over the room. I could hear the grandfather clock ticking faintly from the hallway outside. Tick, 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 steady, cold. Margaret stood abruptly from her chair, holding her wine glass too tightly. Richard was heavily medicated during that period. Careful, Arthur said quietly. There are medical evaluations attached confirming competency. Vanessa looked directly at me for the first time all evening. You knew about this? Her voice sounded smaller now, less sharp. No, I answered honestly, not fully. Arthur slid another paper forward. Richard also included personal written instructions regarding the estate. My chest tightened the second I recognized the familiar handwriting. Arthur began reading aloud slowly. If my children are hearing this document, it means they have already mistaken inheritance for entitlement. Margaret closed her eyes immediately. Ethan looked physically ill now. Vanessa whispered under her breath. Oh my God. Arthur continued. Sophia protected this family when nobody else wanted the burden. She protected me when I could no longer protect myself. If financial control of this estate ever becomes necessary, she is the only person I trust to make decisions not driven by greed, ego, or desperation. The room stayed silent after he finished reading. No dramatic explosion. No shouting. Just quiet devastation settling over people who finally understood their father had seen them more clearly than they ever realized. Ethan rubbed both hands slowly across his face. He thought we were thieves. Arthur answered carefully. He thought you were reckless. That is not the same thing. When debt becomes hidden and signatures become manipulated, Arthur replied calmly, the legal distinction narrows considerably. Vanessa looked toward Ethan instantly. Manipulated signatures? Ethan's head snapped toward Arthur. You said that documentation was sealed. Arthur removed his glasses slowly. It was sealed until tonight. My pulse slowed. Every instinct inside me sharpened quietly at once. What signatures? I asked. Nobody answered immediately. Then Margaret finally spoke in a low, exhausted voice. After Richard's second hospitalization, some restructuring documents were accelerated. Accelerated how? She looked directly at Arthur instead of me. Do we really need to dissect every family mistake? Yes, Arthur said quietly. At this point, I believe we do. Ethan pushed back from the table suddenly and stood near the windows with both hands clenched at his sides. Dad panicked after the stroke, he said flatly. He started treating everyone like enemies. You borrowed against the estate without telling him, Arthur replied. Because Vanessa's partnership was collapsing, Ethan snapped. Vanessa stood immediately too. You approved the bridge financing because you guaranteed recovery projections. Those projections came from your analysts. Their voices rose over each other now, while Margaret stared silently into her untouched wine glass. I sat there watching the entire family unravel and realized something almost surreal. For years they made me feel small because I did not belong to their world. But sitting there now, I finally saw the truth clearly. Their world was never stable. It was simply expensive enough to hide its cracks longer than most. Arthur turned another page carefully. There is one final clause everyone here needs to understand. Ethan stopped arguing immediately. Vanessa looked pale beneath the dining room lights. Arthur met my eyes directly before speaking. Under the trust terms, any attempt to pressure, deceive, or manipulate Sofia Navarro Calloway into surrendering her controlling authority automatically triggers immediate transfer protections and lender notification procedures. Nobody breathed. Arthur's voice stayed calm. Those protections became legally active the night of Vanessa's wedding. The silence afterward felt enormous. Ethan slowly turned toward me, like he no longer recognized the woman sitting across the table from him. Margaret's face lost all color. Vanessa whispered something under her breath I could not hear. Then Arthur placed one final document gently in front of me. As of 48 hours ago, he said quietly, the lenders have already been notified that Sofia Navarro Calloway is now the sole, legally recognized controlling authority over the Calloway estate property. No one spoke for several long seconds after Arthur finished. The fire continued crackling softly beside the dining room mantel, while snow drifted quietly beyond the windows. But inside the room, everything felt suspended in place. Ethan remained standing near the windows, staring at me like he was trying to understand how the woman he spent years underestimating had suddenly become the center of every legal decision surrounding his family's future. Vanessa slowly sat back down first. Her face looked pale now beneath the chandelier light, the confidence from the wedding reception completely gone. Margaret still had one hand wrapped tightly around her wineglass, though she had stopped drinking from it entirely. Arthur closed the folder carefully and removed his glasses. I strongly recommend everyone proceed carefully from this point forward, he said quietly. The lenders are already reviewing the estate structure under Sofia's authority. Margaret finally looked directly at me again. Not with superiority this time, something colder, less certain. You knew this would destroy us. Her voice stayed calm, but I could hear the strain underneath it. No, I answered honestly. I knew all of you were trying to destroy me. Ethan immediately stepped forward. That is not fair. I turned toward him slowly. You sent me legal documents without explanation. Because we were desperate. You humiliated me publicly to pressure me into signing them. That was never the plan. Vanessa let out a quiet laugh that sounded more exhausted than cruel. Ethan, stop lying. At least now. Silence fell again. Ethan looked at his sister sharply, stunned she had said it aloud. Vanessa rubbed both hands across her face before speaking again. We thought if Sofia felt isolated enough, she would just sign whatever Arthur put in front of her to make things easier. She looked toward me then, eyes glossy but steady. I did not realize how far things had already gone financially. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Vanessa. No, Vanessa's voice cracked slightly. We are past pretending. She looked back at me. The lenders started threatening acceleration clauses months ago. Ethan told us Dad's trust language was mostly symbolic. We thought the refinancing would buy enough time to stabilize everything before you noticed. Before you noticed. The sentence settled heavily over the table because that was exactly how they saw me for years. Someone passive, someone too grateful to question anything, someone who would stay quiet no matter how badly she was treated. Arthur folded his hands together slowly. Richard anticipated this possibility almost exactly. Margaret laughed once under her breath, bitterly. Of course he did. I looked around the dining room carefully then. The portraits, the polished silver, the expensive rugs. For years, this house represented power to me, stability, legacy. But sitting there now, I could finally see how much fear had always existed underneath the luxury. Fear of losing status, fear of public embarrassment, fear of financial collapse. What happens now? Ethan finally asked quietly. Arthur turned toward me before answering. Legally, that depends entirely on Sophia. The room shifted again after that sentence, subtle but immediate. For the first time since I entered the Calloway family, every person at that table understood the balance of power had changed permanently. Margaret set her wine glass down carefully. Sophia, she said softly, whatever has happened between us personally, surely you understand this estate carries generations of family history. I almost smiled at the sudden warmth in her voice. Interesting, I said calmly. You spent years reminding me I was not actually part of this family. Now suddenly, I am responsible for protecting its legacy? Her expression tightened immediately. Ethan stepped closer to the table. Nobody is asking for miracles. You are asking me to clean up consequences you all created while treating me like I had no value. That is not true. Then tell me honestly, I interrupted quietly. At what point did any of you plan to tell me the refinancing could cost me legal control of the estate entirely? Nobody answered, not one of them. Even Arthur looked down briefly. That silence gave me the answer more clearly than words could have. I leaned back slowly in my chair. Exactly. Outside, snow continued falling thicker now, covering the driveway and front garden in white. The house felt strangely quiet around us despite its size, almost fragile. Ethan finally pulled out the chair across from me and sat down heavily. What do you want from us? He asked. The question would have satisfied me once. Months ago. Years ago. Back when I still believed being chosen by this family meant something. I looked at him for a long moment before answering. I want honesty. Ethan stared down at the table. And if honesty is not enough anymore? The truth was, I did not know. That realization hurt more than anger would have. Because somewhere beneath the betrayal, part of me still grieved the version of my marriage I thought existed. I reached into my purse slowly and removed my wedding ring, setting it gently beside the legal folders under the dining room light. Nobody moved. Margaret inhaled sharply. Ethan looked at the ring like it physically wounded him to see it there. Sophia, he said quietly, do not do this tonight. I met his eyes steadily for the first time in weeks. Tonight? My voice stayed calm. This started long before tonight. Another silence settled over the room, heavy, exhausted. Final in ways none of us were ready to admit aloud yet. Arthur gathered several documents together carefully before standing. I recommend everyone pause before making additional decisions. Margaret looked suddenly older than I had ever seen her. Vanessa remained motionless beside the fireplace, staring into nothing. Ethan still had not looked away from the ring resting near my hand. I stood slowly and slipped my coat back on. I am not signing anything, I said quietly. Not tonight. Not next week. Not until I fully understand every document connected to this estate. Arthur nodded once. That is wise. Ethan stood immediately. Can we at least talk privately? I hesitated for half a second before answering. I do not know if we remember how anymore. His expression collapsed slightly at that. Small, barely visible, but real. I walked toward the front hallway while the grandfather clock echoed softly through the silent house behind me. Just before reaching the door, I stopped and looked back once more at the dining room where this family had spent years deciding who belonged and who did not. And for the first time, none of them looked certain the house would survive without the woman they once called a freeloader. The divorce was finalized 8 months later on a quiet Thursday morning in March. No dramatic courtroom scene, no shouting across polished tables. Just signatures, legal folders, and the soft scratching sound of pens moving across paper while rain tapped steadily against the windows outside the attorney's office. Ethan barely looked at me the entire time. He had lost weight since the winter. The expensive confidence he used to wear so naturally now looked strained around the edges, like someone carrying exhaustion beneath tailored suits and careful silence. Vanessa's investment partnership collapsed completely 2 months after the lenders froze additional refinancing approvals. Margaret sold the Nantucket property quietly before summer began. The estate itself survived, but barely. Under Julia Mercer's guidance, the trust structure protected the house from liquidation long enough for controlled restructuring to happen legally and transparently. In the end, I chose not to force them out. People always seem surprised when I tell them that part. They expect revenge stories now, public humiliation, cruel payback. But the truth is, once you finally understand your own worth, revenge starts feeling heavy and unnecessary. I did not want the house. I never really did. I wanted honesty. I wanted dignity. I wanted to stop shrinking myself to fit inside rooms where love was always conditional. The final agreement transferred full operational authority of the estate into an independent trust board managed outside the family. Margaret remained in the home under strict financial oversight. Ethan walked away with less money than he expected, but enough to rebuild responsibly if he ever chose to grow up emotionally. Vanessa stopped appearing in society magazines after the lenders opened formal reviews into several failed disclosures connected to her old investment group. Nobody went to prison. Nobody lost everything overnight. Real life is quieter than that. Consequences usually arrive slowly. Through phone calls people stop returning, invitations that disappear, bank accounts that no longer feel endless, empty rooms after guests leave. I moved out of Connecticut completely by the beginning of summer, not because I was running away, because I finally understood that healing sometimes requires new air, new streets, new routines that do not carry old versions of yourself inside every corner. I rented a small house near the water outside Charleston, South Carolina. White porch, blue shutters, wind chimes that moved softly whenever ocean air rolled in during the evenings. Nothing luxurious, nothing performative, just peaceful. Most mornings now, I wake up before sunrise and walk 2 blocks to the marina with coffee in my hand while fishing boats move slowly across the water under pale orange light. Some afternoons I consult remotely for hospital systems expanding patient care operations across the East Coast. Other days I sit on my porch barefoot listening to gulls overhead while answering emails in oversized sweaters with my hair still damp from the shower. It sounds simple because it is. That is what nobody tells you after surviving emotional betrayal. Peace feels unfamiliar at first, then eventually it becomes sacred. About 3 months after the divorce, a small package arrived at my house without a return address. Inside sat my old wedding ring wrapped carefully in tissue paper beside a short handwritten note from Ethan. "I am sorry it took losing everything for me to finally understand what you were trying to protect all along." I read the note twice before folding it quietly back into the box. Then I placed the ring inside my kitchen drawer beside spare keys and unopened candles and never wore it again. Not out of anger, out of acceptance. Some chapters deserve respect, even after they end painfully. A few weeks later, I visited Richard's grave alone for the first time since leaving Connecticut. Early autumn leaves covered the cemetery grass while cold wind moved through the trees overhead. I stood there holding fresh white lilies against my coat and finally said the words I never got to tell him properly while he was alive. "You were right. Not about money, not about the estate, about me. Richard saw strength in me long before I did." That is one of the hardest truths to process after emotional manipulation. Sometimes the people hurting you work very hard to convince you that your kindness is weakness because they benefit from your self-doubt. But kindness without boundaries becomes self-destruction eventually. I learned that too late. Still, I learned it, and maybe that matters most. If someone listening to my story right now feels trapped inside a relationship, a family, or a version of yourself that constantly makes you feel small, I need you to hear this clearly. Love should never require you to disappear in order to keep the peace. Real love does not humiliate you publicly and comfort you privately afterward. Real love does not manipulate your finances while asking for your trust, and your intuition is not crazy just because someone benefits from you ignoring it. Protect your name. Protect your financial independence. Read what you sign. Ask uncomfortable questions. Pay attention when your spirit feels tired around certain people. God, the universe, whatever you believe in, gave you instincts for a reason. I also want you to know healing is rarely dramatic. Most of the time, it happens quietly. One peaceful morning, one honest conversation, one night where you finally sleep without anxiety twisting inside your chest, one moment where you look in the mirror and recognize yourself again after years of emotional survival. That is healing. Slow, human, real. My name is Sofia Navarro. I am 34 years old, and the core lesson I want to leave with you is this. Never hand people so much power over your life that you begin forgetting your own value in the process. Thank you for staying with me through this story, truly. I know there are people listening right now who carry invisible heartbreaks nobody around them fully understands. Maybe you are grieving a relationship. Maybe you are rebuilding after betrayal. Maybe you are just exhausted from trying to earn love that should have been given freely. Wherever you are tonight, I hope this story reminds you that losing people who only loved the version of you they could control is not failure. Sometimes it is the beginning of your real life. And if this story spoke to your heart in any way, leave a comment sharing where you are watching from and what time it is where you live. I still read them quietly some nights with tea beside the window while the ocean wind moves outside. Subscribe only if you feel this channel brings you comfort, perspective, or simply reminds you that you are not alone in what you carry. Somewhere out there, other people are healing too. And before you leave, there are more stories waiting in this playlist. Stories about families, betrayal, quiet strength, and the moment people finally choose themselves after years of silence. If this journey stayed with you, I think the next story will too. Sometimes the stories we need most are the ones that remind us how strong we were becoming all along.